Welcome to NeuroNoodle's Neurofeedback and Neuropsychology podcast, featuring our neuropsychologist, Dr. Laura Jansen's Tech Whiz Santiago Brand, neurofeedback legend Jay Gunkelman, and Sebern Fisher. Oh, the joy, the joy. Our goal is to provide information, promote options for better mental health. This is an all-star cast that are more than happy to share their knowledge with you. My name is Pete, and today, this is going to be Sebern's first show, joining us as a guest host slash co-host. You know, we're going to try it out for the month of April, see if we all play nice and get a head start on Mental Health Awareness Month. So, Sebern, thank you for joining us today.
Oh, it's my great pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Well, of course, we got to pay the bills. Mary Tracy's NeuroTraining Strategies offer a higher standard of EEG, qEEG education to EEG clinicians, technicians, and neurofeedback practitioners with convenient online BCIA and certified didactic courses. Please give us 5 stars on Apple Podcasts. It really helps get the word out. If they can't hear us, we can't help them. And then please subscribe to us on YouTube. That one little subscribe, oh my goodness, the algorithms take off and then everybody's watching it. So please help us out. Sebern Fisher, thank you for coming on board. Sebern, you have a book out there that we bought, I don't know, when we put the shingle up on our door. Could you please tell us about developmental trauma and how you got that book together and a little bit about your background? We had you on the show before, but we get new listeners. And now like a third of our audience is international. So we're going to expose the whole world to you, Sebern.
Well, thank you. I became interested in the issue of trauma primarily as a clinical director of a residential treatment facility in Western Massachusetts, which is where I live. And I worked there for 17 years. And in that process, I learned a few things. And one was that the kids who had the worst outcomes, these were kids who were considered untreatable and had to be in a residential facility, state-sponsored. But it was considered one of the best treatment centers in the state. We had some of the better outcomes, and our outcomes were dismal. And what we started to look at was first was attachment issues in kids, how they had how parents and kids had failed to connect when they were little for a number of different reasons, not always the parents' fault, if there's fault ever to really be assigned here. I had to deal with the treatment side of things, which the attachment literature didn't help with. I became convinced that the most useful treatment approach for staff would be dialectical behavior therapy, which was then coming onto the scene, which is Marshall Lenehan's therapy for, quote, borderline personality disorder. And I want to put that in quotes because as we approach the mental health awareness, we have to also be aware of the disaster that is the DSM. And I know that Jay and I could talk about this for many shows because it's a disaster in ways that we haven't even explicated yet, about how much it has funneled the way that people think and truncated any creativity and understanding how mental health issues arise. There are no causes for these conditions in the DSM with the exception of PTSD. So I have the good fortune of writing about and thinking about and being concerned about developmental trauma, or as it is called in the DSM, because they wouldn't accept that diagnosis of developmental trauma, is PTSD. And PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, is the only disorder that has causes in all of the 157 diagnoses in the DSM. So, but the cause, of course, is never that the brain was deeply impacted by the effects of attachment rupture or out and out trauma, abuse, physical, sexual, emotional abuse. And what we're finding in brain studies is that emotional abuse can be every bit as problematic and have a big impact on brain development as sexual or physical abuse. So that's been my field, and it started with these kids in residential treatment. But I also work with adults, and even though we did everything we knew how with at the residential treatment center, with medications, with therapy, with intensive therapy, with recreational programs, every possible approach we could bring for these kids, most of them would graduate, not all, but most of them would graduate or would age out of the program and end up in some other program or in prison. So it was a dismal situation, and at about the time that I was transitioning out of that position, was at this time that I was learning about neurofeedback and having my own stunning experiences with training my brain, as someone completely skeptical about that you could do anything with electrodes on your head, and I had no paradigm to support it. And Jay and many others have been trying to establish the paradigm so people can understand why this works for years. But I had no language for it, no paradigm for it. I didn't believe it could work, and yet it did. So it was clearly not. And so that at about the time I was leaving the residential program was the time I was picking up neurofeedback.
So the DSM, how long has that thing been out there? I'm going to put the dumpster fire right here, but when did that thing come out? And then
it was really well intended. Diagnosis, therefore treatment. You should get the diagnosis, and there would be an appropriate treatment associated with the diagnosis. And that theory is great, but it doesn't occur. The diagnosis is categorization. It doesn't predict therapy at all. If it did, there'd be some validity, but even the group that authored it declared that it was not valid. It was highly reliable. You get the same diagnosis if you go through the same process, but it didn't predict how to treat somebody. So it's essentially administrative. It's not an assistance towards therapy at all. And ultimately, if you get a diagnosis, it will follow you around like an albatross. And as a young child, if you get a diagnosis that's a problem, it's going to hang around your neck through school and through the rest of your life. You can end up having an adolescent diagnosis keep you from getting jobs within the government. There's all sorts of difficulties with the categorization. And if a diagnosis doesn't work well to predict a therapy, they'll give you another diagnosis. They tend to multiply like cockroaches. It's an awful circumstance. Ron Swatsina de-identified a few thousand subjects, all of their medical records and their EEG, qEEG, and they had 300 and something of them that had been referred in. They found unexpected epileptiform content as one of the highest predictors of medication failure. And, oh, well, that's just for epilepsy, huh? Well, no, 25% of the ADD population, 60% of the autism population, 12% of the anxiety cases, a third of the psychiatric cases that are out there end up having epileptiform content that's unexpected. And if you throw an antipsychotic at somebody who's got an epileptiform discharge, it gets worse. So the badly behaving kid who's actually got a temporal epilepsy driving the rage events is going to get an antipsychotic that's going to make them worse. So the inability to actually look at the pathophysiology instead of some behaviorally linked story that gives you a categorization. You really do need to look at the pathophysiology, not just the story. And goodness knows the adverse childhood experiences now aren't just earlier life trauma. You end up with later life heart conditions and high blood pressures and strokes. And if you have four of the 10 ACEs, you can predict the negative impact on health later in life. So it's important to get down to the pathophysiology, not just the story of trauma.
The individual, and even if it's the story of trauma, which often it isn't, even if people get to the idea, understand that there's trauma involved, which, for instance, with borderline personality disorder, which is probably the most devastating diagnosis to get, and it's most often given to women. And in clinics, it's reported to me that because borderline personality is really an affect regulation, severe affect regulation disorder, right? And if you got down to it, and the most expensive disorder in the mental health system, it's the most stigmatized. And in clinics, they will put on the top of a file in red letters, they'll put borderline. Now, what does that do to the treatment of this individual for this treatment? Nothing good. People avoid these patients if they can. There is literature suggesting that a high percentage of people given that diagnosis also have electroform activity. 50 hertz bursts of 50 hertz, right? So paroxysmal activity at the very least, and that they are trying to manage these brains, and there's nothing, with the possible exception of anti-epileptics, that are going to address this. And those are given. They're called mood stabilizers when they're given by psychiatrists. They're called anti-seizure medication when they're given by neurologists. When neurologists characterize somebody who psychiatrists or psychologists look at as borderline, they call them temporal lobe personalities. They have a sense that the temporal lobe, or they have the awareness that the temporal lobes are dysregulated. And there isn't anything that we're doing, including talk therapy, play therapy, any of the standard therapies that can address a brain that's erupting. What we're doing is stigmatizing people with these diagnoses, and it stigmatizes them in all realms of their life, but even in their treatment. It's a catastrophe.
Done some primary developmental work on the neurofeedback approach to treating PTSD and trauma. And you're to be congratulated on the groundbreaking work. And like most groundbreaking work in neurofeedback, it's driven by a clinician, not by a researcher. And it's quite often just intuitive, following a well-educated guess and drilling down on that with a procedure. And our whole field, Camilla's work was not, it was research, but it was basically just to see whether you could identify alpha versus not alpha. Sturman's work turned into clinical work, but it was basically research at the first with animals, and happened to have a friend who had seizures and got benefit from that. But the clinical work was symptom driven. It wasn't, Barry didn't do a qEEG to do SMR on his friend or the early groups that were done. These were symptom driven protocols. And as yours also was symptom driven, not qEEG driven. It's only after the fact that Sturman started looking at the qEEG and fine tuning kind of where his electrodes may be placed a bit. It's, I think, important for people to think in terms of the foundations of our field being driven by the intuition of clinicians and symptom-driven protocols. that fine tune across time based on experience with the protocol.
Yes.
What you did at the very first matured into what you're doing now, and
Yeah.
those steps of improvements and fine tuning end up being the ground for researchers to dig into with their assessments later of what's the impact of these approaches. And we now have very high level, super fast computers that can do Z-score assessments and things such as that are potential applications, but they still need to develop the literature support for that more. Even that was an intuitive approach to try to normalize abnormal sets of brains. But the field is driven by bright clinical people working hard in an area and getting an idea that a form of training the brain may end up being of some assistance. And it's been fun to see the field mature over the last 50 years for me. And I'm sure you've enjoyed watching the changes across time as well.
I have. I think that I would agree that it's a symptom-driven approach, but that may be the finer tuning. Really, what I'm concerned about is the optimal arousal of the nervous system and how that will manifest in symptoms. So it's even a coarser gradation in a way, Jay. It's like saying, okay, this is very few people escape from childhood trauma and neglect. Neglect may even be the bigger issue. The circumstances that lead to a person suffering developmental trauma with low arousal, right? You're just not abandoned by your parents or whatever the situation is, or left in some way. And not regulated. That's the fundamental thing, is that the child-parent dyad or triad has not regulated this infant for whatever. Either the infant's neurology is hard to regulate, and there's no help to the parents, or the parents have their own histories. There's never blame in this. There's just reality of the difficulty that children can have and that their parents have had as children, that carries on from generation to generation. And that we have, in all of our practices to date, we have focused on the mind. We've focused on the mind in terms of meditation, and all the traditions of meditation have really ignored the brain. The traditions of the mind, which is where Freud was focused, when Freud was a neurologist, but he was focused because there wasn't anything to be focused on in terms of neurology, because there was no way to look at anything. So he became the master of the mind, right? He became focused on the mind. And so we've desynchronized the brain and the mind. It's like they don't link together. And what this whole field of neurofeedback is saying, oh, a dysregulated brain gives rise to a dysregulated mind, period. That's just the way that goes. So you can take a look at the dysregulation of the person's thinking and behavior and say, and you can do this with the help of a cue, or you can do it following a symptomatic assessment and say, training this brain will help them manifest a different kind of set of behaviors and of thinking, of capacity, of learning. All of those things change when the brain regulates itself, which it originally, for whatever reason, failed to do.
Sebern, what are the age ranges for the development? Is it 0 to 5? Because I'm representing the moms and dads out there that are wondering about developmental trauma. What are the age ranges that you really got to keep an eye on? I mean, nobody's perfect. You're going to have issues, dings and dents here and there as, going through life. But What are the ages you really got to watch out for?
You know, there's a way in which it's almost 100% likely that the parents that are concerned about developmental trauma need not to be concerned, that they're already worried about their kids, right? They're attending to their kids. And then we all have to deal with the fact that we were kids ourselves and that we have carried forward certain issues, and we have our own brains as parents, and our kids are going to have to deal with whatever we, bring into the mix. But it's clinicians that have to be concerned about developmental trauma. And the parents tuned into this workshop or this podcast are not going to be people that I'm particularly concerned about. But the devastation, we have looked at the devastation in terms of sort of characterological issues, or in terms of behavior issues, or in terms of these devastating diagnoses, when we need to be looking at it in terms of how can we help this individual who's got their own individual brain, which has its own, I've described the brain as the fingerprint in the quantum domain, right? Everybody's got their own fingerprint. It's completely unique, right? Well, it's like we can't characterize a brain as other than also unique, and that is in, to me, is that fingerprint in the quantum domain. So developmental trauma is an attachment problem. It's when parents aren't paying attention to their kids for whatever reason. They can't help regulate this child, because it's the whole process of affect regulation through attachment, through concern, soothing, empathy, understanding, attunement, that allows for the baby to become regulated and to develop ultimately a prefrontal cortex, which is beginning as early as age 1.
Alan Shore's work historically has been used by others as foundational information. And he looked at the face-to-face encounters with infants and parents, and found that ended up helping to develop the neurochemistry of the emotional system, help regulate the baby's internal level of arousal, and that basic interaction was something that triggered surges of development neurologically. And obviously, missing the face-to-face is one form of trauma. Neglect, an infant in an orphanage with no mobile hanging above them and only seen twice a day for a quick change. There's no face-to-face development there. And then at a year to 2 years, separation, the separation of the parent from the infant ends up being an issue that has to be developed. And at that point, instead of being more of a right frontal development, he points to the left temporal area as the location that shame and guilt, which are associated with withdrawal of attention, are developed. But this age 0 to 3 is fundamental development. You don't really have your background alpha rhythm until 3, 4, 5. So these are experiences that are going to be encoded deep in the brain in frequencies that are not present as an adult consciousness. You've got it buried in slow activity. And the alpha theta style training is one of the ways to achieve access to this deeply buried information that as an adult is kind of pre-conscious or unconscious. It's nibbling around the foundations of how you function, but you have to get down into that state to actually access it, to end up excising it essentially with the adult awareness that's held in the alpha state, and the ability to achieve the access to that information. The sometimes abreactive, but quite often not that dramatic, but just access to the information so you can deal with it. And I think neurofeedback provides that access in PTSD, but that's not the first step. Usually, there's a lot of things you have to do prior to jumping to alpha theta. As the people that did Peniston's work, which was alpha theta training, found if you've got an alpha problem or a theta problem in the EEG prior to the alpha theta work, that can be exacerbated by the alpha theta training. You have to do some pre-treatment before you jump into alpha theta.
Certainly we're talking from the aspect of trauma and neurofeedback. Me as a neuropsychologist, I test a lot of kids, and I would add that there's a lot of in utero development going on. Our executive functioning begins to develop in utero. And, I always think of the reflexes, as a in utero being, one of your first jobs is to get born. Like there's a fancy somersault that you have to do to get out. And then there's C-section births, and we can go into all the other kind of issues that can happen prenatally. And, when there's dysfunction there, then, that translates later in life to numerous host of issues in terms of executive development, things like that. And so I'm talking about physical development and any of the anomalies that can occur. But, we can root it back to the trauma too. There's certainly a lot of trauma a pregnant mom can, experience, and that could certainly translate into issues with a baby. So development happens even before age 0.
Let me comment on that, Laura. There is a case in my book which illustrates exactly what you were saying. I was working with a young woman that had been my patient. She was now in her 30s. She had been my patient as a in the residential treatment center, and had gone on to therapeutic foster care. Had married a man with bipolar illness. Had a lot of. She had 2 live births, 1 abortion, and she got pregnant with a guy that didn't want this baby, and at one point punched her in the stomach. Assault on the mother is one of the worst indicators for attachment disorder later in life. It's like the in utero infant can't even be protected. Okay, there isn't a safe womb. There's no, in the Freudian sense of going back to the womb, there's no good womb to go back to. So this baby was developed as she developed, and movement began, which was about 5 months in utero. She started moving and wildly, and her mother said, "I wouldn't have." She said, I don't think this way, but if I did, I could have thought this baby was aggressing on me. It was elbowing and kneeing and punching, moving constantly. So she had been doing neurofeedback training. She had come back to me as an adult to try this thing because she was so tired of being constantly triggered as an adult. And she had no particular faith in neurofeedback, but she needed to try it. So we did, and she was a very good responder to neurofeedback. She calmed down. Then she got pregnant by this guy, and there are many aspects to this case which are so worth going into, but this one in particular. So this fetal movement is started while I was away. I was presenting actually with Jay over in Austria, I think, and when I came back, she was. She told me about this, and I had just begun to look at a placement called FPO2, and we want to go into that placement because if I show it and I talk about it, people are going to try it without proper, but they have to think about this protocol because it's going to be very powerful. But I had already known that she liked this protocol, calmed her down. it seemed to quiet amygdala reactivity. That was why that's always been my search in neurofeedback. How do I quiet fear? So I had temporal lobe training before that, T4P4, that was very useful to her. I added the FPO2 and she felt blissed out. Now I'm adding it a month later, this utero stuff, in utero activities happening. And as I'm training, not at the other protocols, but at that site, this fetal movement just stops. She said, this baby has rolled over and gone to sleep. So terrified. I was terrified. What has happened here? Okay. And she comes back, and within 3 days, the fetal movement had returned. Wasn't quite as bad. She wanted to do that training again, and yet again, the fetus responded in this way to that particular protocol. This baby was born regulated, easy to soothe, never sucked her thumb, which is an interesting little piece to pay attention to for those who are following. That, if you train the pregnant women to look at how the babies do, right? And there were a lot of things that were quite exceptional about this baby, but that might have been her individual whatever. But I presented this case at ISNR when Alan Shore was in the audience. And what he said was that it was at the time in utero that the amygdala was coming on, the right hemisphere amygdala was becoming activated. The baby was responding, and that when we calmed the mother's amygdala, we calmed the baby's amygdala. This should be replicated. This should be available to people, right? This should be, because this is, to Laura's point, this is the intergenerational transmission of trauma. This is the activation of the mother's nervous system in the domain of fear that activates the baby. And this phenomenon that she was experiencing is often considered to be pediatric bipolar illness, a predictor of pediatric bipolar illness. What I think it is predictive of is intergenerational transmission of trauma.
For the expecting mothers out there, is there a recommended prenatal neurofeedback training that would you recommend for anxiety?
Calming arousal, whatever helps that particular person calm arousal, and can be quite straightforward even at C4, right? It's just calming arousal. And you find a frequency that helps that particular individual feel calm, and that helps everybody. And clearly, this case suggests it helps the baby in utero.
Helps the dad too, and the husband.
It helps the husband. Helps everybody. And the dad could have some training along the way too.
So have you guys seen anything since like 2007? I think that's when the iPhone came out. So the kids would be, 15 now. Do you see any different types of diagnoses from when that iPhone came out and the parents paying attention to the phone and not paying attention to the kid? Just curious.
If you roll back the clock to 1999, Linden, Lubar, and Monastra did a theta beta ratio paper, and CZ's theta beta ratio was identified as a biomarker for PTSD. Now, the theta beta ratio was replicated in 2001. That data was given to the FDA. They approved theta beta ratio as a diagnostic biomarker for ADD/ADHD. The problem is that since 1999 to now, adolescents get on the average 2 hours less sleep per night. potentially because of media. In fact, that's the best guess, going to bed with your tablet or iPhone and having it be a texting kind of a reverberating circuit of waking people up. So you don't fall asleep on time, and in the morning you get beeped and email coming in and whatnot. So the 2 hours less sleep per night. Right now, the normal population has a worse theta beta ratio than the clinical group did in 1999. Yeah, that study is a meta-analysis study that was published, basically looking at the theta beta ratio. And let me.
But that's for ADHD, right? Not PTSD.
That's correct, but
Yeah.
the same sleep issue and arousal related change ends up being common for the entire group of kids. So this is the clinical group mean and standard deviation in 1999, and this is the normative comparison. The range of the standard deviations didn't even touch, so it was a very good discriminator. In fact, the effect size was tremendous early on, but the effect size has plummeted in this meta-analysis. You can see now the effect size is so bad that you really can't use it to discriminate. Here's the normal group now. It's worse than the clinical group was then, and you no longer can differentiate the normal from the clinical. So ADD versus normal, the theta beta ratio doesn't work anymore. Why? Probably because of media. And again, 2 hours less sleep per night. It's hard to find an EEG that stays wide awake with the eyes closed. In fact, the inability to maintain a vigilant state ends up being misdiagnosed as ADD. If you're spending time in stage 1 sleep, you're really not focusing. You can drive a car in stage 1. I wouldn't recommend it. You're right next to stage 2, which is sleep. But highway hypnosis, you can actually drive a car, stay in your lane. You're not really good on your reaction time. Again, I wouldn't recommend driving that way, but people do. You find yourself down the road at exit 20, and how'd you get there? The last one you remember was 5 exits ago. So drowsiness is an issue. And vigilance training, arousal training, ends up being an important thing to do to maintain the ability to regulate this. Anyway, that's something that's happened, I think, because of the media, and this drowsiness ends up being something that impacts every single diagnostic category. It's obviously quite visible in the theta beta ratio data, but it isn't just the ADD kids that are doing this.
Whoever the ADHD kids are, because there we are quite again in a specious diagnostic category. We all have to rely on, but we have to remember that this is fiction. So the other thing, in terms of the face turning away from the baby, that's really what you're asking about, right? With the phone. Yeah. I love this. What Jay just said. This is really important. But it is hard to know. Except we know that's not a good idea, right? You can't imagine, if you didn't have a phone in that picture, that mother was attached to that baby if she was looking away from that baby the whole time. And as Jay was saying in the Shore, but it's Ainsworth way before Shore. I mean, Shore didn't write his book about attachment. He started to write it as a kind of homage to that the brain science was going to substantiate Freud. And then he found the attachment literature. He was directed to the attachment literature, and then it all started to make sense to him what he was seeing. And then he became the person who really reinvigorated the understanding of the importance of attachment. But looking away from your baby like that would be seen as vastly abnormal. Right? It'd be wildly. I mean, if you saw that in a clinic and there was no phone in the picture, say, what's going on here? Right? So best to put down your phone to be with your baby. and to attend. It's going to be very hard. We don't have clinical interviews, that best of my knowledge, that ask the person how much their or I mean, we should, how much their parents used, cell phones, or so we don't know. We don't know how to discern that. But we can imagine how startled we would be if we saw a mother and baby at a table in a restaurant and they weren't looking at each other. But we're not startled by that when there's a phone in the picture. And often the baby has a phone now too, right? Because they're showing cartoons to the baby on the phone.
So the kid's not getting enough sleep and the parents are ignoring them. And then we wonder why we're...
No problem. Right. Right.
I've actually seen people in the same room call each other.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking, well, they're right there. Look over and talk to them. No, they're texting back and forth in the same room, and it just strikes me as being absolutely an insane way to end up behaving. That there's a person in the room and you're relating to your phone. Well,
there's no eye contact, no trust. The kids today going for a job.
Yeah.
I mean, they can't look the employer in the eye. I mean, it's hard for them to get a job, even though there's so many out there. How do you correct that, guys? You got the moms and dads that say, "Oops, okay, I screwed up. My kid's 16. What can I do?" He won't look at anybody in the eye because he's staring at his phone. Take the phone away.
One of the things that I see very commonly is that people who can't look at somebody in the face have the area that can comprehend the face. Facial expressions and body language are perceived as a spatial signal, and the right temporal junction here picks that up. And if you actually have this, it rivals 0102 as the largest background resting state. And with your eyes closed, you've turned off the input to the back of the head and the visual cortex, but this area isn't getting any input either. And literally, if you wake this area up, they will start to be able to perceive faces, body language, on nonlinear kinds of perception. So it's possible to reactivate this location. If you're blind, you've got a cane, a red and white cane, you tap in front of you, everybody knows you're blind. Well, this person is as blind as a bat, but it has to do with faces and body language. We should get a purple cane or a green cane or something like that, so people would know you're blind as a bat for emotion. But you can't carry your qEEG above your head and tell people that you're not functioning in that area. But literally, this person needs to wake this area up and get it working. We usually do a gentle stimulation. Temporal lobes don't like to be overstimulated. There's limbic structures there, and you don't want to overdo those. But if you gently activate this area, the alpha, which is a resting state, will drop down, and they'll actually start to perceive outside emotion. The difficulty with the therapy is that when you wake up emotional perception and it hasn't ever worked, the first thing it's going to do is misperceive. It's not good at perceiving, and whatever comes in is potentially not going to be perceived accurately. Very much like a cochlear implant that gives somebody sound that they've never heard. Everybody's happy. The baby hears the mother's voice and everybody's happy. But really quickly after all of that, they want to turn it off because of all the noise that they're hearing. Well, it's not noise, it's the richness of your auditory environment. And you want to turn off your emotional perception fairly quickly for the same reason. That the perceptions weren't pleasant in some fashion, but you have to stay perceiving in order to get good at it. So it's an opportunity for therapy. You turn this area on and then work with them with respect to their perception. But until this is working, you just, again, give them a green cane, let them walk around and bump into things emotionally.
And
But
this is the argument, right, for why we do this, at least in the population that concerns me the most, within a therapeutic structure, not just as a technical issue, because this has a great deal to do then with interpretation, with adaption, with understanding what this means. I mean, I had one Asperger's patient of mine, she started to get better, start to discover empathy. Wow. So she'd heard the concept of empathy, but she never felt it. So she started to feel empathy. Yeah. Empathy often relates to this site as well, because it's reading faces. It's reading, it's being able to interpret as Jay was saying, the body language, but also the facial expressions of another person, which she hadn't been able to do. And so, you know, she said, she was describing this experience to me, and I said, well, you've just begun to experience empathy. And she said, oh, this is what they mean by empathy. So it's an incredibly rich, but again, this has to be a guided and interpersonal experience. I don't do therapy via text. I don't do, you know, it's hard enough to do it with Zoom, right? To start but there's face and there's vocal tone and there, so, but to the point here with neurofeedback, this can change just about everything. The brain is extraordinarily plastic. And eye contact, way before I knew anything about neurofeedback, I would work with my patients in the residential treatment program on eye contact, because none of them made it. And in fact, it's physically painful if you've had serious trauma in your history of neglect. It hurts probably it hurts to have a cochlear implant too. It hurts to get that feedback. It physically hurts in the eyes. So people don't practice something that hurts. It hurts. So you know, I had to work with them on a cost benefit analysis of making eye contact. And then it has to be genuine. Otherwise they're staring at somebody. No, that's genuine eye contact. Well, that's an interpersonal skill. That's a learning that happens between two people, not between a person and a computer.
So guys, to kick off, you know, to get ready for May, because we only care about mental health once a year for 30 days. What would be the biggest recommendation if you can make a blanket statement what to do to have better mental health? I'm going to throw it out there. I'm guessing you guys are going to say get sleep. Is that what it is, or what would you recommend?
It's a big ball of wax, isn't it? But yeah. You know, when I wrote the book, I wanted to at the end summarize how I thought it should best be, neurofeedback should best be utilized, and I don't want to be shy about that here in our forum, because this is where we get to say what we actually feel, right? Mm-hmm. Sleep is great, but how do you get sleep in this kind of in noisy environment? So how do we learn self-regulation? And it feels to me that, you know, I had neurofeedback recommended just about every venue possible, drug treatment, mental health centers, blah, blah, blah. But primarily where I think it should be, where kids should learn the fundamentals of regulation, obviously in their families, if their families are gifted with regulation, and they can bring that to their child, then we're not worried about that kid anyway. But in the schools, and gifted children get more gifted, and dysregulated children, well, it's all peak performance. All neurofeedback is about peak performance. It's not about disease. It's about getting this brain to work optimally. So your good chess player becomes a great chess player, right? And your kid who's throwing a desk across the room and can't read a book starts to be able to read, and they don't want to throw books anymore. I mean, they don't want to throw desks anymore. Mm-hmm. They'd rather read. So, you know, we could use this technology that people are so fascinated by. They could become fascinated with their own regulation in their own brains, and we could bring this into the schools. That's what I would most hope for, is that every kid gets their birthright, which is in the attachment literature is self-regulation. And if they've missed that opportunity for whatever chaos they had to encounter as they were children, they get another shot at it through a regulating environment that teaches them about emotion and about their bodies and about their brains, and they get to figure out how to work with their own brains. What could be better?
I
That's
think,
my
I think that sleep is foundational. One of the things that will slow down the acquisition of neurofeedback's learning curve is people that aren't sleeping well. If you're not sleeping well, you don't have memory consolidation. So if you learn 3 things in your session, you remember 1 the next day instead of 3. So it takes you longer because you're backsliding because you're not sleeping well. So paying close attention to your sleep ends up being foundational for the rest of the things that you do in your life. There are routine sleep hygiene things that you need to pay attention to. There are some people that need some specific assistance with neurofeedback for sleep insomnia issues. But for a normal person, paying attention to your sleep hygiene ends up being the important thing to do. There's a period before it's bedtime that you need to wind down. You're not supposed to eat late. Pick a routine bedtime to get your circadian rhythm trained. Make sure the bedroom is pitch dark because light intrudes into your sleep. Drinking alcohol, a lot of people think, well, it helps me fall asleep. Well, it ruins the quality of your sleep. So drinking in the evening is something you have to pay attention to, use moderation. The quality of your sleep ends up affecting everything in life. So pay close attention to your sleep hygiene. And you think sleep hygiene, what's that, like a shower before you go to bed? No, these are all the behaviors that have to surround your sleep to make it work properly. And again, there are people that have particular problems with sleep. Neurofeedback is a wonderful treatment for insomnia. We've got biomarkers that can predict, when you look at the EEG, that the person suffers from insomnia. And when you treat those biomarkers and they're treated effectively, the insomnia goes away. So it's something that we handle really quite well. Unfortunately, it wasn't really fully proven until 2005, but even in 1980s and 90s, people knew that you could help with insomnia, SMR to assist with sleep onset and the stability of sleep, sometimes some beta even, but the quality of sleep ends up being foundational. On top of that, put your phone on a leash. It has to be trained how to behave. What time of day do you feed the darn thing with your attention? You limit your kids' access to media, but you're free range media consumer yourself. It's not a good message for the kid even. So put your phone on a leash and treat it as something that has to be trained up to be used properly. If you fix your sleep and you handle your media properly, it's going to benefit the quality of your life. And goodness knows, if you end up having a concern over mood state or anxiety or any other thing, there are therapists out there that help with these things. Quite a few of them do neurofeedback to assist. So don't be shy about reaching out if you have a concern.
Sebern Fisher, thank you for joining this fine crew. How can we learn more about you?
Oh God, whether you want to?
Yeah, I'm going to put it right here.
Well,
you got this book. We're going to
I
sell
got
this book.
Someplace around here. I'll show you the book. This is the book. And it is, developmental trauma is not rare. So we can explore that a lot more. But I have a web page on SebernFisher.com, and people can go there. And that's all they need to know.
Yeah, we're gonna send them there, Sebern. I'm gonna try to sell you a couple books so you can buy yourself a cup of coffee.
Oh yeah, exactly. If that. Won't be a latte. Right. Okay. Thank you.
All right, guys. We thank you all for listening to NeuroNoodle's Neurofeedback and Neuropsychology podcast. We'd like to thank our Patreon supporters, especially Mary Tracy's NeuroTraining Strategies. She offers a higher standard of EEG, qEEG education to EEG clinicians, technicians, and neurofeedback practitioners with convenient online BCIA and qEEG certified didactic courses. Register now at eegstrategies.com. Do you have an idea for a topic or a guest? Please email pete@neuronoodle.com. The emails are flowing, guys. I'm getting them all. I'm replying to you, and I'm trying to fit them in. Trust me, we'll get to them all. Or leave us a voicemail in the link in the podcast notes. Please give us 5 stars on Apple Podcasts, and please subscribe to our YouTube channel. YouTube is the way to go. Please hit the subscribe. You hit the subscribe, and all of a sudden the world opens up, and we get popular, and we're helping people. And hey, if you really, really like us, you can always buy us a coffee on Patreon/NeuroNoodle. We love our Patreon peeps, don't we, Jay?
Absolutely. Where do they get this kind of coverage for that kind of cost?
Cue the music.